What's interesting is when Scripture first introduces us to this gentleman Job, we learn a number of things. Number one, he's extremely wealthy. Everything financially has gone very well for Job. We also would assume from what we're told that he is very healthy. He enjoys good physical health. He's also, as the Scripture says, he's very spiritually focused. Actually, he's identified in Scripture as being blameless. So he's a very devout man, very spiritual man. And we find that he's an immensely loving father who apparently his major concern, or at least one of his major concerns about his children, is their spiritual well-being, because he is offering sacrifices for his desire is for them to be spiritual as well. So this is the Job that we're introduced to. We look at his life and we would say, wow, who wouldn't want that? Wealthy, healthy, spiritual, good family, good children. But then Scripture brings us to a conversation that happens between God and Satan. And Satan accuses Job of a self-serving faith. In other words, the only reason, Job, that you're having faith in God is because of what you get from God. And so God says, well, you know what? That's just not so. And he tells Satan, you can take away, you can remove Job's blessings, and he does that. But Job stays faithful. Then, Satan continues the claim. Well, the only reason that he's faithful is because what you've given him. It's not the stuff around him, it's about him, himself. So God says, well, you can go ahead and touch him, but you can't kill him. And so Satan afflicts the body of Job physically, but Job remains faithful. Job faces the horror of loss and pain, and in the midst of it all, he knows that God is somewhere in it. I mean, he recognizes, this is horrendous, this is terrible, but somewhere in all of this, God is here. It's unique in the book of Job that we never find Job mentioning Satan. Job himself. The book talks about Satan. But Job never references any authority at work in his life other than God. Not like the Flip Wilson thing, the devil made me do it. He never is attributing anything to the evil one, only to God. The tempter never becomes Job's focus. It isn't, oh, look what the devil has done to me. Look at the trials that he's put upon me. The blame is not ever placed upon him. There's no accusation of responsibility on the part of Satan as far as Job's pain is concerned. Job knows full well who the authority is in his life, and he never takes his eyes off of that authority for a moment. Job recognizes God is at work. I want to mention this morning 4 different threads that I see that kind of weave themselves through the book of Job. And as we continue to read this next week, I think you'll find many of these things still significant as you go through the reading. And the first one is this. And whenever you think of the book of Job, you obviously have to think of suffering. But the first thread that runs through the book is the suffering of Job. And let's go ahead and read from the first chapter. One day when Job's sons and daughters were feasting and drinking wine at the oldest brother's house, a messenger came to Job and said, the oxen were plowing and the donkeys were grazing nearby, and the Sabines attacked and carried them off. They put the servants to the sword, and I'm the only one who has escaped to tell you. While he was still speaking, another messenger came and said, the fire of God fell from the sky and burned up the sheep and the servants, and I am the only one who has escaped to tell you. While he was speaking, another messenger came and said, the Chaldeans formed 3 raiding parties and swept down on the camels and carried them off. They put the servants to the sword, and I'm the only one who has escaped to tell you. While he was still speaking, yet another messenger came and said, your sons and daughters were feasting and drinking wine at the oldest brother's house, when suddenly a mighty wind swept in from the desert and struck the 4 corners of the house. It collapsed on them, and they are dead. I am the only one who has escaped to tell you. I want to begin this whole discussion of suffering with an observation that I tried to process for myself this last week, and it'll probably give us some good fodder for discussion tonight. So make sure and come back. As I contemplated what I think is our normal human response to times of suffering, it appeared to me that the type or the level of suffering that we feel has a correlation to our understanding of the fairness or unfairness of a given situation. The level or the type of suffering that we feel is correlated to how unfair we believe that situation to be. Let me just offer some application of that I think will help explain a little bit. Almost every one of us has been born with some unique characteristics. We had no control into what family we came into. We were just born into that family. We didn't have any control about that. We didn't have any control about our ethnic background. We didn't have any control about the size of our nose or the thinness of our hair or the straightness of our teeth. And some of those things, we have industries that have been developed to change some of those. But the reality is, there is always something that we can't change, that we were born with. And we come around to the point where we live with it. While some of those we wish we could change, we don't tend to hang on to a limited or to an extended idea of suffering over that distinctiveness. In other words, we become accustomed to what it is. We adjust. Put another way, we seem to have some ability, anyhow, to adjust to the cards that were dealt at birth. We may wish things were different. We may wish this was different, but we still adjust. And we don't tend to go through life with this, oh, woe is me, pain and suffering because of the original deck of cards that we were given. We tend to adjust. However, suffering, I think, becomes intensified, or at least different, when we unfairly think we're dealt a new hand. We adjusted, we understand what we have and the original things, and we've made that all work. But let somebody give us a different hand, and now our suffering is different because it's tied to an element of what we consider to be unfair. When things are perceived as being unfair, the suffering level seems to be greater for us to deal with. As we look at Job, we look at this thing and we read, and it's like, boomity, boomity, boom. One guy finishes talking, here's the next guy. He finishes, here's the next guy. Just bam, bam, bam. Job's getting this information. I read that, and you know what I think? Man, that is so unfair. Is that what you think? At least spread it out. Why just all this, all at once? And so what we tend to do is we look at Job and we say, wow, that was so unfair. And so the suffering of Job is considered so great because so much happened to him that was not fair. I don't think any of us would have any difficulty believing that robberies and weather catastrophes are among the things that we recognize as most unfair. Most unfair. We read these things and we feel the pain of Job. The unfairness of all these events tends to intensify our view of Job's suffering. Yet, was that Job's perspective? Is that what Job thought? How much of Job's contemplation of his pain and suffering was related to what he considered to be unfair in his life. And I tell you what, I've just missed this until I was reading and studying at this time. Do you realize that Job perhaps is unique in this situation? Look at what Scripture says. At this, he's gotten all these reports. At this, Job got up, tore his robe, and shaved his head. Then he fell to the ground in worship and said, naked I came from my mother's womb, and naked I will depart. The Lord gave, and the Lord has taken away. May the name of the Lord be praised. Do you get any sense of unfairness in that? Is Job thinking something's happened in his life that's not fair? That he's been dealt a new deck of cards, a new hand, and that it's totally out of line? Do you pick that up? I don't hear that. I don't hear that in this. I don't hear it at all. We may be doing Job an injustice if we consider the endurance of Job, which is what James tells us to do, as only being connected to the painful realities of the terrible unfairness that was brought into his life. Job just endured all these unfairnesses, and that makes his suffering so great, because it doesn't appear that that's where Job was at. And in fact, it may create for us a more accurate context of understanding the whole book of Job if we view that Job is not dealing with a plight that he considers unfair, but rather his search is to understand the fairness of this. Not to complain about the unfairness, but I need the understanding of the fairness in God taking away my wealth, taking away my health, taking away my children. So for Job, the greatest trial may not have been the pain or the actual loss. It may have been getting stuck in a space where he did not have an understanding of the fair reason these things should enter his life. Now, I really want to go to preaching here, but let me just remember his friends. Remember what they're talking to him about? And Job debates with them. No, that's not true. That's not the reason. It can't be because those things aren't. They're saying, this terrible, unfair thing has happened to you because you've sinned. And Job knows that's not true. Job is in search for the fair reason that this has all happened. And he becomes obsessed with that. And therein is Job's issue. It's not that Job is stuck in the unfair mindset. Job is stuck in, this is fair, God is God, but you know what? You need to explain this to me. I need to know why this is fair. Not I need to know why you allowed this unfair thing to come to me. Like I said, bring that back tonight. This may be a very similar situation to which Jesus dealt with. Remember when he came to the point where he was about to suffer the extreme gift of his life, where he was at that point of suffering. I don't think Jesus was looking at anything that was unfair, do you? Was it fair for Jesus to bear the sins of humanity? I mean, he wasn't looking at this as being an unfair thing. It was a fair thing. He knew what it was all about. He understood. But what he asked God for, he said, I need to understand this cup. This is fair. But does it have to go this way? Is there another possibility? Is this really your will for me? And I don't think Christ was centered on how unfair it was. He was saying, remind me again of why this has to be this way. Okay, the second thread. First one was suffering. Second one is, of course, this gentleman identified in Scripture as Satan. The Lord said to Satan, where have you come from? And Satan answered the Lord, from roaming through the earth and going back and forth in it. Then the Lord said to Satan, have you considered my servant Job? There is no one on earth like him. He is blameless and upright, a man who fears God and shuns evil. Does Job fear God for nothing? Satan replied. You've put a hedge around him and his household and everything he has. You've blessed the work of his hands so that his flocks and his herds are spread throughout the land. But stretch out your hand and strike everything he has, and he will surely curse you to your face. The Lord said to Satan, very well then, everything he has is in your hands. But on the man himself, do not lay a finger. Then Satan went out from the presence of the Lord. Okay, I want to break this thread down to its fibers. And the first thing about the fiber I want us to notice is that Satan's craving is to interrupt one's connection with God. That's what he longs to do. That's what he longs to do, is to make interruption in our connection with God. In John chapter 8, Jesus will tell a group of Pharisees, he says, you belong to your father the devil, and you want to carry out your father's desires. He was a murderer from the beginning, not holding to the truth. For there is no truth in him. When he lies, he speaks his native language, and he is a liar and the father of lies. You see, Satan has a single desire, and it's to bring separation between humanity and God. As Sebastian mentioned, that's what he did in the garden, and guess what he continues to long for today? He longs to be the separator between those who are trying to be faithful to God and God himself. That's what he longs to do. It's what he longs to do in the life of Job. It's what he longs to do in the life of everyone who serves God today. The second fiber, Satan can never exceed the limits of God. Satan can never exceed the limits of God. The conversation that goes on between God and Satan makes it very plain. God is the one who is the authority. He set the perimeters. Satan was not capable of going beyond those perimeters. Satan is not the antithesis. He is not the evil God in the universe. He is a creature of God and subject to God's sovereignty. And so, Satan can never exceed the limits that God puts upon him. That brings a sense of peace to us from passages like, the temptations in your life are no different from what others experience, and God is faithful. He will not allow the temptation to be more than you can stand. When you are tempted, he will show you a way out so you can endure. God will not allow us to be tempted beyond what we can stand. Just like in Job's case, God knows exactly what we're able to stand. He will set the perimeters of all those trials. 1 John chapter 4 and verse 4, you are from God, little children. You've overcome them, talking about the world and the things of the world, because greater is he who is in you than he who is in the world. Again, the one who rules the world, the evil one, is subject to the powers of God. And if we have the power of God at work in us, then the one who's in us is greater than him. Another fiber, we cannot control how Satan attacks. We can only control how we respond. We can discuss, what Satan might do to tempt anyone and how he works in that realm, how he's a lion in the description of Peter seeking to devour folks. We can engage in all kinds of theological discussions about the specifics of how that may or may not happen. But you know what? It really doesn't matter, because what really matters is our response to those trials. We can't control what Satan does. We can only control how we respond to those trials, those temptations that he might be in charge of. And so, consider it pure joy, my brethren, when you face trials of many kinds, because you know that the testing of your faith develops perseverance, and perseverance must finish its work so that you may be mature and complete, lacking nothing. So, we know that our response to the trial is of the greatest significance. Not how the trial got here, but our response, because that's how we grow. It's how we mature. The joy that's talked about there, count it all joy, it's not the common word that's used in the New Testament for happiness, which means a prolonged state of joy or happiness, excitement. Rather, this is a word that means to be calmly happy, to recognize the well-being or how well off one is. So the point that James is making here is that the trials of life, or Satan, however they come, bring us the opportunity to view them as contributing factors to our well-being. So whatever happens to us by way of suffering, by way of the hand of Satan, whatever happens to us, comes to us for our own spiritual well-being. Another thread we find through the book of Job is sovereign God. Sovereign God. Throughout Job, we see God as a number of things. He's all wise, he's all powerful, he is perfect. His actions not always understood by humanity. We get that picture within Scripture. Again, God will let us know through the prophet Isaiah, my thoughts are not your thoughts, and my ways are not your ways. And then he will say, as the heavens are higher than the earth, so my ways are higher than your ways. You know, God's understanding, God's ability is beyond us. He is sovereign God. And so when it comes to understanding life, suffering, Satan, the things of God are significantly higher than the things of our realm, the things that you and I can comprehend. And because of that, way back in Deuteronomy chapter 29, we read early on this year how that there are secret things that belong to the Lord, that the things that have been revealed, He has revealed. But there are other things He doesn't reveal. And they're not for us to know. They're not for us to comprehend. Maybe most of them we couldn't comprehend anyhow. God is all wise. His actions are not always understood. Also, God is served because of who He is, not because of how we feel. This sovereign God, when Job felt like the greatest things of his life had been removed from him, he worshiped. He tore his clothes and worshiped. Do you think he felt like it? Or do you believe he was motivated to do that because of who God was? You know, sometimes we may not feel like engaging in our spiritual responsibilities. What we learn in Job is that God is sovereign and He needs to be served despite how we feel. At this, Job got up, tore his robe, shaved his head, and then he fell on the ground. And then verse 22, in all this, Job did not sin by charging God with wrongdoing. Job recognized the sovereignty of God. And then also, God is all that is needed, so we best be hanging on to Him. He's all that we need, and so we need to hang on to Him. Lastly, the last thread is the sufficiency of faith. We've seen suffering and the multiple ways that can come into our life. How we can over-exaggerate suffering by our feelings of unfairness. We've seen how that Satan desires to separate us from God. That's what he lives for. We've seen that God is sovereign, but also there is the sufficiency of just trusting. Job never did know the aims behind his anguish. God never really explained it to him. You know, we haven't got there yet, but we will this week. When Job and God finally have a discourse with each other, God never says, well, here's why I did it. Here's the fairness of the suffering that came into your life. God never explains himself. By the way, he doesn't really ever have to. But what happened in that exchange was Job became a greater individual of faith. He learned the sufficiency of his faith. In spite of all his suffering and sorrow, Job did not give up on God, which reminds me of, memory verses from childhood. Hebrews chapter 11 and verse 1, faith is being sure of what you hope for and certain of what you do not see. Faith still comes down, folks, to an issue of trusting unseen things. We don't walk by sight. Faith still comes to a point where we may be totally void of understanding, of explanation, of being able to logically reason something out, but we have trust anyway. And in the book of Job, we learn that. We learn that despite Job's inability to comprehend what was behind his suffering, even in the fairness of it all, he just trusted. He just trusted. And we know that without that kind of faith, it's impossible to please God. Because everyone who comes to him must believe that he exists and that he rewards those who earnestly seek him. Peter will put it this way: so then, those who suffer according to God's will should commit themselves to their faithful Creator and continue to do good. If you're suffering for doing God's will, guess what? You commit yourself to keep going. You commit yourself to a greater trust, to a growing faith, because that's the plight. The New Living puts it this way: so if you're suffering in a manner that pleases God, keep on doing what is right and trust your lives to God who created you, for he will never fail you. And how about this in Revelation? As the book is drawing to a close, this is a discussion about the horns and the horned animal. Then they will make war against the Lamb, and the Lamb will overcome them, because he is Lord of lords and King of kings, and with him will be his called, chosen, faithful followers. Who's going to overcome? Those that are the followers, those are the faithful trusters of the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords. So the tapestry that we find woven through the book of Job is there are certain truths about suffering that are revealed in this book. There's also much revealed about the nature of Satan, his desire. There's also the sovereignty of God that is seen and witnessed. And there is the important lesson of how our faith needs to be sufficient, needs to be enough. Sam has asked for us to end our service this morning with the song Softly and Tenderly. It's number 565 if you need your songbook. And he asked for me to put up there for us to sing it softly and with tenderness. So as we sing about the calling of Jesus in a soft and tender way, we will try to emphasize that in a musical way as well. So Jesus is calling, and amid all of the suffering in everyone's life here today, Jesus still calls us, and he says, my yoke is easy and my burden is light. Put your trust, your faith in me, and I'll be there with you. Not to remove everything, not to make it all well, but you'll have my strength. You'll be yoked with me,